Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 159, The Theatre Couple in Early Modern Italy, a conversation with Serena Laiena. For today's guest episode, we're going back to the Italian Renaissance theatre and the world of the Commedia Dell'arte. You will remember that I covered the Commedia and other early Italian theatre in Season 4 of the podcast, but in this conversation with Serena Laiena, we have much more detail about a particular theatrical couple and the world of 16th century Italian theatre. In her book, The Theatre Couple in Early Modern Italy, Self-Fashioning and Mutual Marketing, Serena looks at the birth of a phenomenon, that of the couple in show business, where she focuses on the mutually beneficial promotional strategies devised by two professional performers, the husband and wife team, Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi. Serena Laiena is Assistant Professor in Italian and Ad Astra Fellow at University College Dublin. Her research focuses on early modern Italian theatre, especially the Commedia dell'arte. Most of her time is devoted to the understanding of the social and cultural role of the first professional actresses in modern history. The award-winning monograph that is the basis of our discussion today was published in 2023 by the University of Delaware Press. Currently, she's working on a book-length project focusing on the correspondence by and about professional actresses to bring to light the managing role that they performed within theatre companies. I spoke to Serena over Zoom from University College Dublin. So it's been a while since I mentioned Giovan Andreini and Virginia Ramponi as part of the series of episodes on the Italian Renaissance theatre. So perhaps as a reminder for everybody, could you start with a brief sketch of the theatrical world that they operated in?
Okay, yes, of course. So we are in early modern Italy, and Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi are among the brightest stars of the dramatic form that we today call Commedia Dell'arte, which developed, as many of you already know, in the 16th century Italy, so in northeast of Italy. The first contract we know of Commedia Dell'arte was signed actually in 1545 in Padua, so in really mid 16th century. And I always, when I talk about Commedia dell'arte, I always try to describe it while looking at the names by which Commedia dell'arte was known in the 16th century, so where this art form was born, because actually these original names were carrying the main characteristics of the forms. So, for example, Commedia dell'arte was known as Commedia delle Maschere, so comedy of masks, because, of course, Commedia dell'arte uses masks for some characters. So the character of Pantalone, for example, or the character of Zanni were masks, as many others, but not all of them were masks. For example, the innamorati, the young man in love or the young woman in love, didn't wear a mask. And also because there were sort of the recurrent same fixed types within different comic plots. So this was another key feature of Commedia dell'arte. So usually we refer to maschere not just as physical masks, but also as these types.
Right.
And also it was known as Commedia all'improvviso, improvvisa, so of course related to the improvisation, another key characteristic of Commedia dell'arte, but the improvisation of the actors, of course, actors and actresses, of course, happened around the plot, a scenario or a soggetto. So also Commedia soggetto is another way of defining Commedia dell'arte. So of course, this form of improvisation was a structured improvisation, wasn't really the kind of spontaneous improvisation we would imagine today. It was something very technical, very well organized, well developed. Also, these Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi were part of the first itinerant actors who were doing this as a profession, who were performing as professional actors, and who were part of really trading companies, so companies that did this for money. And this was another reason, another characteristic for another key name for Commedia dell'arte, which was Commedia mercenaria, so mercenary comedy, which was derogatory, of course, at the time, because the idea of mercenary was, of course, always connected to mercenary troops that in early modern Italy weren't doing very well to the country. And of course, the idea was that these people were using an art that was supposed to be something elite and amatorial, mainly as a profession, as something of, in a way, a lower state in the perception of many at the time. And one of the main innovation, the greatest innovation of Commedia dell'arte, and also the greatest gift to European theater, was, of course, the introduction of women on stage. So this was another key element that was part of the world Virginia Ramponi and Giovan Battista Andreini operated in, and is part of the reason why Virginia Ramponi was a diva at the time, because she inherited, in a way, the fame of other famous actresses who came before her.
So they weren't coming in at the beginning of the post. There was an existing environment for them to step into, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, the first companies was mid-16th century. The activity of Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi happened at the beginning of the 17th century. So, 50 years more or less were between the two events. And actually, Virginia Ramponi started like 40 years before the beginning of female professional acting, because actresses appeared on stage at the beginning of the 1560s. So sort of 15 years after the birth of theater companies as professional theater companies. So everything was like at the second part of the 16th century was really a moment when things in theater, in professional theater, were developing very quickly, and there were a few divas before Virginia Ramponi who were model for her. You might have heard of Barbara Flaminia, Vincenza Armani, Vittoria Pillissimi, Isabella Andreini. These are some of the most important actresses in early modern Italy.
And I know your book isn't, strictly speaking, a biography of them, but can you tell us a little about where they came from and how they got into the theatrical world?
Yes, so Giovan Battista Andreini was an actor and playwright. He was actually the most prolific Italian playwright of the 17th century. Right. He wrote every sort of genre. He debuted on the literary scene with the tragedy, and we will perhaps have the time to go back to this later on. But he also wrote comedies, many comedies, of course, and several musical plays, some pastoral plays. So he also wrote a play that was into 3 acts, and the first act was the first act was a comedy, the second the pastoral, and the third a tragedy. So it was the kind of playwright who really liked experimenting with theater genres. He also wrote encomiastic poetry. He wrote treatises in defense of theater, or treatises about the profession, generally speaking. So he really wrote every kind of literary form, and was fairly famous as a playwright. And Virginia Ramponi, on the other hand, was not just an actress, but also a singer. She was very well known for being an endowed singer. She performed in 1608 in the title role of Monteverdi's Arianna, so in one of the first opera performed in Italy. So she really became from then onwards more and more famous also as a singer, and she was invited to participate in other performances in this capacity. But the origins of the two are very different. So Giovan Battista Andreini was born into a theater family. His parents were Francesco Andreini and Isabella Andreini, arguably the most famous actors and actresses in Commedia Dell'arte. And so we sort of have clear traces about his first years of activity. We know that he started playing around the very beginning of the 17th century, so about 1600, and then he also started writing in about 1604. While Virginia Ramponi, we barely know anything about her origins. She probably came from Liguria, so northwest coast of Italy, probably from the city of Genoa, but we are not sure about that either. Mm-hmm. And we don't know really how she trained. So we can expect that Giovan Battista Andreini sort of was trained by his parents, but we don't know a lot about Virginia Ramponi. The first document we have about her is dated 1603, and in that document there are references to the fact that Isabella Andreini, so Giovan Battista's mother, was part of the training of Virginia Ramponi, so helped her at the beginning of her profession. So that's an interesting remark, also because usually actresses are known to be very competitive with each other. That's
right.
The general idea of actresses is that they were rivals, especially the diva. But of course, in this case, we have family bonds. So Isabella Andreini was part of Virginia Ramponi's career path. Yeah, so they started together. We have information regarding their debut on the literary and performative scene in about 1604, and then we know that they were part of a theater company under the patronage of the Duke of Mantua, and this company was called the Fedeli, so the faithful ones, and was a very successful company. And they played the part of the innamorati, so young man and young woman in love. So they were usually a couple on the stage and behind the scene. And they toured not just in Italy, but also abroad. They were very successful performers also in France, in Paris, in Prague, in Vienna, and in many other places around Europe. And probably she was a much better performer than he was, because letters in relation to them are usually referring to her as a performer, and usually to him either as a playwright or as her husband.
I know you spent a lot of time in what I can only imagine are very dusty Italian archives. Can you just give us a sense of what documents you're using to gather this sort of information? And then do you really get to know them as personalities, or are they still just historical figures?
Yeah, so I mainly use correspondence. So correspondence by actors or actresses, or correspondence about them. I also refer to some receipts of payments, for example, or some leaves to perform. So it was very usual in Italian city-state at the time to be granted a special leave to perform in a city, because performance was not something allowed, generally speaking, especially by professional companies. And the leaves to perform are very interesting documents, because in many instances I came across leaves they were granted to actresses. So they were in the name of the actress, of the lead actress of the company. And this happened in the case of Ramponi, but also in the case of Isabella Andreini or Vittoria Piissimi, other actresses who were active before her. But the letters are, of course, the bit I'm more interested in, and are also very, very fun to read. You really get a sense of what was going on in that period. You really think that you are connecting with these people in the past. And it's what I realized by reading the letters by Giovan Battista Andreini, for example, which are many more than those by Virginia Ramponi, is that Andreini was usually more cautious in his interaction, especially with some patrons who were sort of high up in the social ladder, and he was very diplomatic in a way, and was to some extent very subservient, while Virginia Ramponi was very much determined, very assertive, sort of strong-minded character. She was very good at negotiating, at setting condition for herself, for a company, for the couple sometimes. So this was quite an unexpected result from me, and it's what made me very much interested in actresses more than actors at the time. So after looking at Ramponi and working on her for my first book, I now moved towards looking at other actresses in Commedia Dell'arte and their activity behind the scene more than on stage.
So the sources sound quite similar to what we might find from the London theatre from the similar time period, with the exception of obviously the London records wouldn't mention actresses in the same way. Interesting to hear that you have that connection, you find that connection with them over the centuries. And the extent of the London records often comes from the permissions to act given by the Privy Council, or the discussions they have about when actors should and shouldn't be happening. And it sounds like that's quite similar for the individual Italian states from the same time as well.
Yeah, it is similar, but again, in that case, we have a very clear presence of actresses also as like present also on official documents as granting her or them the leave to perform, which was again not necessarily something you would expect for the time, for that period.
And looking at those documents, is it fair for me to equate it to if I was trying to read, as an English speaker, a 15th, 16th century document? I mean, the language is similarly arcane and the writing styles are similarly difficult to interpret?
It really depends on who's writing. So the hands vary a lot for the corpus of letter I'm looking at. The handwriting of actors and actresses is usually very bad, and they sometimes write in a hurry. But it depends on what kind of letter they are writing, because it might be the case for them to ask for something very special, for example, for when they ask for financial help from a patron, they might take an extra care in their hand writing. Giovan Battista Andreini's hand is much more understandable than, for example, Ramponi's, and this might be a case of different sort of education, and this is consistent also with the fact that his parents were both writers. And in terms of language, of the Italian language, the Italian at the time was not as far from the Italian we would read nowadays, as opposed to the English of nowadays and the English of the 16th century. So it's archaic for some expressions, and especially the syntax is maybe a bit weird, but it's not that difficult to understand. And the most difficult part, of course, is when the handwriting is very messy. In that case, it's very difficult to understand some passages and so on. But
presumably there are gaps in the record in the same way that there are in the records for London.
Absolutely, yes. And there is a matter also of visibility. So, of course, women were definitely more visible than actresses in England, for example. But still, of course, their presence is not as widespread as that of men. of the time. So of course you have to do a bit of extra digging for actresses, and sometimes you have to look at, again, indirect sources. So for example, you might for male actors, it might be the case of finding documents written by them. In the case of actresses, you might find something written by them, but it's mostly others writing about them and describing, for example, how they manage companies, how they negotiate for things, how they ask for favors, how they set conditions, and so on.
So let's talk about your study in particular. You focused it on the achievements of Andreini and Ramponi as a couple. It seems to me that they managed to promote themselves effectively at a time when being a performer was still quite a difficult position to be in, as you've already mentioned, the lowest of the low, as they were in London as well. So can you give us a few examples of the kinds of challenges that they would have faced as a performing couple and how they overcame them, even though, from what you've just said, they were clearly at the forefront of and came into that existing theatrical family?
Yes, exactly. So they are, to some extent, an exception, even though they too faced challenges. The challenges for professional performers were mainly of two kinds. I would say, on the one hand, moral, of course, and on the other hand, especially if they were writers, as in the case of Giovan Battista Andreini, there was a literary challenge because they wanted validation also as writers, and this was something that was not easy to get in the early modern Italian context, when especially theater, the theater of Commedia Dell'arte, especially the theater of professional performers, was not considered to have the status of literature. So they tackled both in different ways, but in what I argue for Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi is that they had their sort of individual career pathways, but they also had a sort of overarching unitary strategy that allowed them to work for themselves, but also for the partner, and to achieve their success together. So marriage was, of course, a key element in the strategy. Being married for performers was a plus, was something that sort of validated you as on the moral side, because you were considered to be a faithful Catholic, respecting the sacrament of marriage, being sort of devoted to the husband or the wife, and was, of course, the first ethical license in a way. In terms of literary validation, Giovan Battista Andreini, for example, decided to debut in a way on the literary scene with the tragedy I mentioned earlier, and this is the only tragedy he wrote in his whole career. So this is interesting because this was, of course, the result of a precise strategy, of a choice. He wanted to show that he was able to harness also a genre like the tragedy, and he did this at the very beginning of his career in 1604. And he sent this tragedy to an academy for approval. This is again something unusual, and was clearly something very well planned. He wanted to address directly the people who counted as intellectuals at the time, but he also wanted to have approval from them in order to be himself acknowledged as a man of letter. So, for example, in the case of his tragedy, his first tragedy, his only tragedy is entitled La Florinda. He obtained a sort of official acknowledgement from the Accademia degli Spensierati in Florence, and the academy he sent his tragedy to. And this academy was chosen very carefully, again, because some members of his family, of Giovan Battista's family, had already connections with these intellectuals in the academy. So, of course, it was a sort of welcoming environment for him. Was an academy whose member had written already tragedies and pastoral plays. So plays that were similar in a way, to some extent, to what to the play Andreini wrote. And in terms of content of the tragedy, Andreini wrote La Florinda in a way to sort of show that he was a devout man. There are several references in the tragedy to the value of marriage, to morality, to religious ritual. Several things that sort of reminded the audience to the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent's dispositions and so on. And then Virgilia Ramponi, for example, played their part in obtaining this validation as a devout woman in a way, and as a faithful wife, also through the things that Giovan Battista wrote, because the characters Virginia Ramponi played were usually shaped by Giovan Battista, and where in a way Giovan Battista was transfiguring through dramaturgy the image of his wife, of Ramponi. So, for example, the character of La Florinda, the character in this tragedy, is a virtuous woman who cares about her honor, who has boundless love for her child. Motherhood is something that is particularly recurring in some plays that want to shape a specific idea of actresses. And of course, the tragedy was also meant to sort of highlight the performing skills of Ramponi. So was a tragedy in which you have some musical elements that, of course, were especially made for her, and you have this strong lead character. So there was a lot of interaction between what they wanted to convey through the stage and what they wanted to convey through, for example, letters and so on. And everything was part of a carefully designed strategy. Virginia Ramponi and Giovan Battista Andreini were very good at producing a specific image of themselves. Giovan Battista Andreini mainly as a man of letter. So through the publication of his tragedy, La Florinda, but also through the publication of treatises in defense of theater and so on, he carefully shaped this image. Also, he wrote several treatises that had a strong religious element. The scholar Fabrizio Fiaschini has written a lot about this, and Giovan Battista Andreini was very good at presenting himself as a devout man who was very well aware of what was going on during the Counter-Reformation period, was very well aware of the importance of sacraments and so on and so forth. And this, of course, helped them achieving success. On the other hand, Virginia Ramponi was very good at producing, of course, an image of herself as a diva, and this was again the result of a coupled strategy, because on the one hand this was due to what Andreini wrote, but this was also due to how she presented herself also through her correspondence off the stage, in the way she talked to patrons, the way she sort of set her conditions, into the way she wanted to appear as the leader of, for example, her company, and she actually indeed was the leader, was having leadership roles within the company, together with her husband, but sometimes even apart from him. And they also used, for example, iconography to convey this image. They used the visual arts. Giovan Battista Andreini, for example, asked a painter to reproduce an image of Virginia Ramponi as Mary Magdalene in one of his texts on Mary Magdalene, and this, of course, helped the readers sort of identify the character as, in a way, also the actress, and vice versa. So the promotion happened at several different levels and was very much intermediate, and was done together in the sense that she, of course, wrote letters that helped the couple and presented the couple as not just a strong couple, but also a couple that worked together, that had this leadership of a company. We have, for example, a letter in which Virginia Ramponi protests against another famous actor, Tristano Martinelli, that was sort of that he could not be in charge of the leadership of the group, and that the leadership had to be granted to herself and her husband. So she also sort of worked in that sense in order to make very clear what was the role in the theatrical hierarchy of her and her husband.
And we should also mention that your book includes reproductions of some of those illustrations, which are absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you. Yes, I particularly like the book cover because it's a collage made of birds' feathers. So it's a very peculiar product of early modern Italy.
And I think you mentioned there that this is all during the time of the Counter-Reformation in Italy. So I guess they didn't have too much scope for doing anything adventurous in the way that Shakespeare and other English playwrights could flex some Protestant muscle through their plays.
It really depends on the audience. So the great ability of Commedia Dell'arte performers was to be able to reinvent themselves on the basis of the performance of the occasion. So they were very careful in what they published, but we have several treatises written by detractors of professional performers, saying that you can't really regulate Commedia Dell'arte because even when you ask to pre-approve the scenarios, the performers present to you scenarios that are sort of approvable, but then they go on to performing something else on the stage via improvisation. So this is again. So there were things that were not really in line with Counter-Reformation, but this again depended on where they wanted to convey their message and who they wanted to address.
And they both had relatively long careers. Were most of that time spent touring within Italy? Did they get outside into other European countries at any point?
Yeah, they went several times to France. They went to Prague, Vienna. They toured a lot outside Italy, and they obtained a fairly reasonable success, especially in Vienna and Prague. They were very much appreciated, and there are several requests also for them from other rulers abroad. So they toured quite a lot.
Yes, it was a real international form, the Commedia dell'arte, wasn't it? Because I suppose because mostly it could be understood and enjoyed even if you didn't understand Italian.
Yes, absolutely, and of course Italian was understood in several of the courts were touring to. But and there were several gestural elements, and of course the singing of Ramponi helped in obtaining success also when they didn't understand the language.
Now, she's thought to have died in about 1631. I don't think there's an exact date, but her husband lived on for another 20 years. So How did he fare? Was the partnership so important that he could find a life after his wife died?
Yeah, so there is actually a fault in the story we haven't had the time to discuss yet, because in 1620, so about 10 years before Ramponi's death, Giovan Battista Andreini started an extramarital affair with another actress in the company, again a Virginia, but in this case her surname was Rotari. Now, the documents related to the activity of Giovan Battista Andreini and Virginia Ramponi in the years from 1620 to Ramponi's death in 1630 are not as abundant as those related to the first years of their activity. But we know, for example, that in the performance, in their performances in Prague and Vienna, they were very much appreciated as a couple, and they were still achieving success together. Mm-hmm. So we also know that the affair, that Andreini's affair actually lasted longer than Ramponi's life, because Andreini probably married Rotari, so this other Virginia, his lover, after Ramponi's death. So we don't know exactly the extent of the impact on the couple's strategy of this affair, but we have reasons to believe that they still were very careful in shaping their image together, even though with some, of course, turmoil, especially in the early 20s. We know that, for example, in the early 20s, there were a lot of fights within the company. Several actors who were part of the company mentioned Andreini's affair in their letters. And we also know that Andreini tried to elaborate this affair also through his comedies. So in the early 20s, he wrote comedies starring both his lover and his wife, and sometimes in the plot, the lover and the wife are rivals for the love of the innamorato, or Giovan Battista himself. So of course he tried to also shape his plot according to his personal vicissitudes. What we know for sure is that in 1650, so 20 years after Ramponi's death, and 4 years before Andreini's own death, he wrote a letter to his patron asking for financial help. And in that letter, he mentioned both his mother, Isabella Andreini, and his wife, Virginia Ramponi, and he sort of asked for help in the name of Isabella and Virginia. So in a way, after 20 years, he sort of realized that it was a good strategy to remind the patrons that he was figlio di Isabella, so Isabella's son, and Virginia's husband.
Wow, that all got very complicated, didn't it? Very meta, as we say these days. And how did the memory of them live on in the theatre? Were they a power couple that were remembered for a long time?
So in the immediate aftermath of their career, also during the final years of their careers, the memory of them was, of course, very vivid, very lively. Giovan Battista Andreini, for example, in the 2 years before his death, he staged a play starring a very young actress at the time, Ursula Cortesi, who was going to become one of the stars of the next generation of Commedia Dell'arte. And she then, for example, moved to France and married Domenico Biancolelli, another very famous Italian actor in Paris. And of course, probably the the example of Giovan Battista Andreini helped her. Of course, he was influential on her training as an actress and on her debut especially. Also, Virginia Ramponi helped some younger actresses and trained some of them. We know that, for example, an actress, Vittoria Bernardini, explicitly asked to be member of Ramponi's company in order to learn from her. So, of course, the memory was very much present in the generation that came immediately after them, but then the memory of both of them was sort of fluctuating, especially between the 18th century and the present day, in the last, let's say, 50 years of scholarship. Ramponi was mainly known to music scholars, so she was mainly known as a opera singer.
Right.
While Giovan Battista Andreini was mainly known as a playwright, so mainly as a man of letters, so theater scholars, but mostly scholars who were working on literature were interested in him. So the challenge there was to bring them together as a couple, to show that the achievements were very much interconnected, that whatever Andreini achieved as a man of letter was also achieved thanks to Ramponi's performance, but also thanks to her activity behind the scene in granting a certain visibility for Andreini's works and granting special connections for the couple, while what Ramponi achieved was also achieved thanks to the kind of characters that Andreini shaped for her, and that, of course, gave more visibility to her skills. So it was really a tandem operation, and it was important to sort of reconnect these two sides of the story and tell them together.
My thanks to Serena for taking the time to talk to us today. Her book, The Theatre Couple in Early Modern Italy, Self-Fashioning and Mutual Marketing, is published by the University of Delaware Press. And I've put links to it on the show notes and on the episode page of the podcast website, where you'll also see the cover of the book featuring that illustration that we mentioned during our conversation. Serena is now working on a further study of professional Italian actresses of the period and how they performed managerial roles in the theatre companies, and I look forward to talking to her again about that when her work is complete. Next time, Shakespeare's King John takes centre stage as I take a look at this lesser performed history play. And in the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com, or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.